Hello and welcome to a new episode of Faith and Spirituality in a Time of Crisis. My name is Chris Fuller and I'm the Chief Sponsorship and Mission Integration Officer at St. Joseph's College of Maine. This has been a series of conversations with faith leaders, theologians, philosophers, and others about adapting during this time of the coronavirus, and more recently with the events surrounding the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent protests. Earlier, one of my conversations was with Molly and Dana, a Native American leader in Maine. And that was the first of a series of conversations with tribal representatives from across the country. Today's episode is with Dr. Shane Doyle, who is an enrolled member of the Crow tribe and who hails from Crow Agency, Montana. He has a master's degree in Native American Studies from Montana State University and a doctorate in Curriculum and Instruction from Montana State University. He is a founding member of Native Nexus, an educational consulting company that helps the state of Montana implement its Indian Education for All curriculum. So please join me for this conversation with Dr. Shane Doyle. So I introduced you by making reference to Indian Education for All. So could you share with our viewers what is Indian Education for All? Because Montana is unique as a state with regard to this program, correct?
Yes, that's right. Great question. Montana was unique, but now we're just one of many states that have tried to implement the same basic measure. But what I think what separated Montana is we were the first to do it. It was in our state constitution. We revised our constitution in 1972, and it became one of the most liberal constitutions in the United States. In fact, far and away. And it had guaranteed rights like clean air and clean water to every Montana citizen, and it also guaranteed the right of every learner in Montana to learn about the Native American culture of the state.
Mm-hmm. So what is your organization, Native Nexus? How does it help with those efforts?
So interestingly, Chris, even though the state implemented the law in the Constitution, or it was part of the Constitution in 1972, it was never actually funded until 2005. So there wasn't much of an effort to get the curriculum into the schools until just about the past 15 years. And so my group, I had just completed a master's degree in Native American Studies. I had a background in education. And there was a great need for curriculum in the schools, and that's how I began getting involved, and I've just stayed involved ever since.
That's great. So I asked you to be on because, for people who aren't familiar enough with tribal cultures, when we hear the phrase Native American or American Indian, we might tend to think it's a monolithic culture, that all Native Americans are the same. But in fact, they're quite different, as all cultures are, depending on geography, history, dynamics of culture. So I asked you to be on because of your, both as a member of and expertise with Native Plains tribal communities and their cultures. So what would you describe as some of the distinctive features of the Plains kind of tribal communities?
Great question. And it's great to understand, the diversity of the cultures in America. And they're almost always based on the geography, the climate of the region. And so here on the Great Plains, we have extreme weather, and we have very little resources as far as trees. It's mostly a landscape that, as the name implies, it's plain. It's got a lot of grass. There are niches of trees. And so we weren't able to develop the type of farming culture that you see on the East Coast. And so that's probably the biggest difference, is that we're hunter-gatherers and traders. We traded frequently, and we developed a sign language because of that. But we moved camp seasonally. So we moved our homes. Whereas back east, and even on the West Coast, and actually almost every place else in America, the people's kept the same home all year round.
Yeah. So when we talk about, again, one of those kind of generalized thoughts about Native cultures in America is they were nomadic, but in fact, it's more about the Plains communities than it was about communities on the coast, correct?
Absolutely. And in fact, nomadic is also kind of misleading because they frequently traveled the same seasonal cycles
Mm.
year in and year out. So there wasn't much leeway between what decisions they were going to make and where they were going to travel.
Sure, thank you. That's very important. So nomadic implies kind of random, but in fact they were very intentional. They knew the seasons, they knew where they were going, they knew the landscape, so they knew what to expect by their movements, each with each variability of the seasons. Correct?
That's right. And Montana is very much a landscape with niche environments. And so if you know when to go to the certain spots, when the plants will be available, when the berries will be ripe, where to camp during the winter, all those little special pieces of knowledge that are accumulated over generations of living on the land.
That's great. So we're hearing a lot in the news about the impact of the coronavirus in general, and we're also hearing
Yep.
about its impact on some other communities, such as African American, Latino communities. But we're actually not hearing a lot about its impact on tribal communities. So, what has been the impact there in terms of Montana and other kind of plains tribal communities with regard to the COVID-19?
That's a great question. One of the things, Chris, is that most Native Americans live in the West, and they don't live in the far West. They live kind of on the plains area, and especially down south. The nation that's been hit hardest right now is the Navajo Nation, and they have a very high mortality rate. I think it's like fifth, and their infection rate is one of the highest in the nation as well. So they're being heavily impacted right now. They're a long ways from getting out of the woods. They've had, I believe, at least 150 people die in a Native American community. That is significant. Yeah, I mean that is a lot of people to die in a short amount of time. So they're really struggling with it. Most communities here on the Great Plains, they've shut all access to their communities off now, and they've been that way for a long time. You may have heard about, I don't know if you've heard, but in South Dakota, the
Yes.
Cheyenne River Sioux
Mm-hmm.
are having it out with the governor right now. We don't have that problem here in Montana because our governor totally supports us in all that we do. My tribe blocked off an access to a real high profile, high tourist zone area, and it caused some backlash in the community, but nothing to the extent that people were going to really challenge it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, explain. You mentioned South Dakota, and I know South Dakota is not where you live. You live in Montana, but can you explain from the kind of tribal perspective why it's important for the tribe to be taking those measures? In terms of, like you said, in Montana, it's not been a problem, but there have been these tensions in South Dakota. How can we better understand the tribal perspective in terms of the decisions they're making to block access?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, I think the tribes and the tribal leadership really believes that they're in a time when they need to close quarters. This isn't the first time we've been through crisis, Chris. We've been through crises since day one. We suffered one of the most dramatic pandemics in world history, the smallpox epidemic in the late 19th century. That's still in our collective memory. People still talk about that when I was growing up. And so we understand what to do. We know what to expect. It's just a time. We just need to be patient. We just need to set things aside for a while and focus on, staying healthy, staying safe. And so I think that's what's driving the Native communities to do that. The friction that they've received, not to be too blunt about it, but basically we have a Democratic governor here in Montana, and he really tries to go lockstep with the tribes. He's got a great Indian advisor. He spends times on the reservation, and I believe the governor in South Dakota is a Republican. And I think more often than not, you see Republicans that challenge the tribal sovereignty of the nations. And so, I mean, like I say, I don't want to make it that simple, but in this instance, it kind of seems to be pretty clear.
Yeah, and that's an important point too. I think that people need to understand is the tribes are sovereign nations, which means they have the right, correct, to make these decisions about access to their lands.
Absolutely. We're not completely sovereign, but we're semi-sovereign. And when it comes to issues like this, we do enjoy that privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And we have negotiated over the years, not just treaties, but also compacts with the state of Montana. There's a lot of water under that bridge. This isn't the first rodeo that
Mm-hmm.
we've all experienced.
Yeah.
This one obviously is more sizable and more dramatic. But I think, it just makes sense that the tribe wants to protect its community, because I can tell you something, we are a vulnerable community. We
Mm-hmm.
have a high rate of diabetes, we have high rates of heart disease, cancer, we have high rates of elderly folks who are on chronic medication. We have a very low, our healthcare quality is not good. Our healthcare, our hospitals, our clinics would be completely overwhelmed, even with just a dozen patients. And
Mm-hmm.
so, we can't afford to take any chances. I think people feel really strongly about that. The community has come together in many ways. It's been a little while. In my community in Crow Agency, we suffered from a major flood back in 2011. It was historic in its magnitude. It cut off communities for like over 10 days, some of them. And so, like I said, we understand what it's like to go through a crisis. And quite frankly, as far as the unemployment rates and all that stuff, that's nothing compared to the reservation, what you're seeing in America. And, I think a few people have said, well, now America knows what it's like to be a reservation.
Mm-hmm.
It's turned into a giant res. And so in some ways, that's kind of how it feels.
You raised the importance of cultural memory, right? The especially communities like African American communities, Latino communities, Native American communities, they carry cultural traditions, they carry cultural memory. And I think you made a really good point about the tribal communities, the cultural memory that they can draw from in terms of they've been through this before. From your perspective, what can we, from the non-tribal perspective, learn from your experience? What have you perhaps seen in terms of how we've tried to address this? That are we missing something that the Native perspective could help us better address this?
That's a great question. I think with so many of the external aspects of our lives being kind of cut off right now, we've all had to really focus on our families and kind of look internally, a lot of us. And I think that that's been a hallmark of indigenous spirituality. And that's also a hallmark of a ceremonial way of life. And I think that those are things that we need to elevate in our national consciousness, and we need to, make sure that they're a part of our decision making at the very highest levels. And there's been a lot of really nice talk about this is an opportunity to be a great realization, and I feel like the longer it goes on, the more of an opportunity we have to actually make that happen.
Mm.
And so, this needs to be part of our collective memory now as a world, as a society. And we have to take some lessons from it, the way Native people have taken lessons from their traumas in the past. And one of those is healing.
Mm.
How do we heal? And I think that, we're realizing now as a country, we've been hurting for a long time, and we've been hurting our planet. We've been hurting ourselves, our communities, in ways by not giving them the proper attention and care. And so, this is an opportunity for us to change our ways.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned spirituality and ceremonial traditions. What are some of those traditions, either within Plains traditions or your own Crow tradition, that are helpful to your communities right now to be drawing upon?
Yeah, and some of them actually make it a challenge during this time as well. Like we're very close knit community in terms of family and extended family, and wanting to spend time with people. And when there's a death in the community or a birth or something like that, there's a lot of people that come together, and this whole thing has really, put a stop to all that. And so it's been a challenge. At the same time, we communicate with each other. We use all the same communication devices everybody else does, telephones, Facebook, FaceTime, like all of the advanced technology. Back home in Crow Agency, the ceremony that's used most frequently and has been used a lot during this quarantine time is the sweat lodge. And it's a really beautiful ceremony. It's a high intensity ceremony. There's steam that's involved. It's hot, and Native people, Crow people, have always used that as a way to cleanse themselves. It takes some time to build the fire, to get the rocks hot, to go in and engage a ceremony. That all takes time. But at the end of that period, you're renewed spiritually, physically. And so I think, like I said, taking a ceremonial approach towards your life is a good thing. One of the things I learned to do as a young man that my uncle taught me how to do is fast. And, during this quarantine time, all of us are eating so much because we're in a house with food. And, I just, trying to think about my own spiritual needs, I decided, I need to take one day a week and fast, and just to, that's how they used to do it in the old days, just to remember the priorities in life. And you don't always have to be consuming, there's time just to be, and you don't have to always keep growing, like we always believe in this eternal growth in America and all that. And I think in a ceremonial way of looking at it, like in the way I was raised in the Crow tradition, it's okay just to be just to stay okay, just to be cool, man. That's fine. That's a good thing. You don't have to be always trying to get more and more and more.
That's very helpful. I think especially right now, since many of us are working from home, I think the pressure is to feel almost more productive than when we're in our offices. And I think that's a really great perspective is actually, you know what? Yes, it's great to be able to work from home, but also it's great to take time for yourself just to be, right? Or to take stock of the traditions that have informed who we are, what we draw from, and kind of reevaluate those traditions and find a new meaning in them in terms of how they give structure to our lives.
And also, I want to thank you for bringing up, Chris, what can we learn from Native people? And I encourage everyone to take what they can learn. Sitting Bull said that about white people. And, you kind of said that you made that comment at the beginning that a lot of folks feel like maybe Native Americans are one monolithic thing. And I think for Native Americans, sometimes white people are that big monolithic thing, right? And but Sitting Bull said, hey, these white people have a lot of good stuff. Take what's best from them, and just if you don't like it, leave the rest behind. And so, I think those are wise words, and I think that they apply to all of us, and they apply to to any of us who live in multicultural societies, and that's pretty much the world at this point.
That's great. So is there a resource where I could direct our viewers in terms of if they wanted to know or learn a little bit more about Native American kind of traditions? Is there a resource where I could direct them?
So that's a great question. I always ask people to turn to the tribal websites in their local communities. Usually the tribal government has their own website. The tribal college, those are also probably one of the best resources, especially out here in the West. If you want to learn about the tribes or gather resources from their databases, go to the tribal colleges. The National Museum of the American Indian has some nice links. And so if you get on the web and search a little bit, there's some really bad stuff out there.
Sure.
So try to go to the legit.
Yeah.
Try to go to the legit.
I think those are helpful first steps. Either the Museum of Native American History or the tribal websites themselves in the state where people might live, and look at those websites and begin there, and then look up the different traditions. Well, that's great. Well, thank you, Shane. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for all the work you do, helping people better understand tribal communities and their cultures.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I just wishing blessings for all of your students and everyone out there in your neck of the woods.
Great, and blessings to you and your communities there in Montana as well.
Aho. Take care, Chris.